Forgotten kings disappeared from history, leaving thrones empty and kingdoms broken. Some vanished in the midst of war, while others faded in peace without explanation. Their absence sparked rivalries, conspiracies, and endless bloodshed. These mysteries still haunt the chronicles of the medieval world. You are watching Medieval History. A dense fog clung to the banks of a frozen river, wrapping the ruins of a once proud castle in muted gray silence. The towers loomed like broken teeth, jagged against the reluctant sun, while the wind wound its way through shattered stones, carrying with it the bitter tang of soot, damp earth, and splintered wood. Long vanished, their voices echoing in chambers, now drowned in stillness. A solitary page knelt among the cracked flagstones, his fingers tracing grooves cut deep by iron-shod boots. He followed the path of banners, once raised in triumph, now reduced to torn cloth and rusted poles, their colors long consumed by rain and time. Every scar beneath his touch told a story of ambition, of fear, of power, claimed and lost, of men who believed their names eternal, yet found themselves buried in silence. A great hall stretched before him, a grave of memory, its roof caved in its hearths, cold where once laughter thundered, and councils plotted where swords clashed and voices argued destiny. There was now only the hush of wind through fallen beams. The air itself carried a weight, as if the ghosts of courtiers and captains still lingered unseen, their whispers rising in the page's mind like embers refusing to die. A raven's wing cut through the mist, slicing the pale veil of morning. It circled above the broken battlements, as if keeping watch, a black sentinel bearing witness to secrets still sealed in stone. Chambers and forgotten passageways, behind rusted doors, behind rotting wood, there lay truths that no scroll recorded, and no bard sang. Truths of betrayals, hidden, of loyalty broken, and of crowns exchanged not in honor but in shadow. The boy's hand brushed against a crown half buried in frost, its gilding dulled, its gems torn away by desperate hands. It was light yet heavy, a relic of vanished command. And when he lifted it, the silence seemed to press closer. In that fragile circlet lay the weight of vanished authority, kingdoms that rose and fell with its glitter, alliances forged in its name shattered by its weakness. The boy shivered not from the cold, but from the breath of memory, as if every broken oath and every desperate prayer once spoken in this hall stirred faintly against his ear. The fog swirled through the crumbling archways, moving like smoke from fires. Long extinguished shadows stretched across the walls, as if the very stones reached out to remind him of what had passed. And in that shifting light, the page saw more than ruins. He saw a dynasty breathing again, faint and fragile, like a flame on the edge of being snuffed out. For there had been kings here, kings who ruled not just with swords, but with silence, with hidden bargains whispered behind closed doors, with promises sealed in blood and broken in darkness. There had been queens whose words bent steel and whose prayers were knives beneath velvet. There had been servants who listened unseen and betrayed unseen, soldiers who fought and died with no name carried into the soil, only by the sound of weeping left behind. And now their stories lay half buried in the frost, waiting for a voice to breathe life again. The boy felt the river's presence. Beyond the walls, its waters moved silently, reflecting the pale light of the weak sun, as if carrying away the memory of this place. Grain by grain, shadow by shadow, Yet the river never forgot. It bore on its surface the weight of ashes, the cries of sieges, the bodies carried down its flow into darkness, and still it moved forward, indifferent yet eternal, a mirror for the fragility of power. The page rose slowly, his breath clouding in the chill air. He looked once more at the broken banners, at the crown that no longer shone, at the vast hall whose echoes belonged to no living voice. He felt the truth coil within him like a whispered oath that greatness does not vanish by steel alone, but by silence, that history chooses what to remember and buries what it wishes to forget, that kings and kingdoms can fade not with thunder, but with a quiet sigh, lost in the fog. Raven cawed, and the boy turned his eyes toward the horizon, where the mist began to thin there in the distance beyond. The crumbling stone lay villages, still clinging to life, peasants who bent their backs against the frozen soil, monks who copied prayers by candlelight, wanderers who whispered rumors of other fallen lords. The ruined castle stood as their warning, as their reminder that power once shining bright could dissolve into shadow, with nothing left but broken crowns and cracked stone. The boy did not know if he should fear this truth or carry it like a torch. He only knew that, as he walked away, the fog closed behind him, sealing the ruins once more in silence. The raven circled above, then vanished into the gray sky, leaving only the sound of the river flowing and on. So the chapter of Forgotten Kings ended not with a roar, but with a whisper. Yet in that whisper lay the seed of what came next, for where thrones crumble, the people remember, where crowns rust, faith and betrayal take root. And in the silence of ruined halls, a new story waits to be born, carried on the wind toward the next reckoning. Moonlight spilled across the courtyard like a pale shroud draped over the ruins of forgotten splendor. The frost upon the stones glittered faintly, but the silence was heavier than any crown ever forged. The scent of damp earth mingled with rot and rust, reminding all who breathed it that grandeur could crumble into decay with terrifying ease in the center of this desolation. A young scribe crouched before a broken throne, his fingers brushing the weathered carvings as though he might summon back the voices of the kings who once commanded from its seat. Groove in the wood spoke of command and reverence, yet also of fear and blood. The throne was not only a seat, but a judgment, a burden, and a curse carved with lions and serpents. Symbols of power and betrayal intertwined. The scribe traced them with trembling care, aware that these were not ornaments, but scars etched into the heart of a kingdom, now reduced to whispers in the night air. Above the walls, an owl called its cry, carrying across the forest, beyond, mingling with the sigh of the wind, as if even the night itself mourned those who had been swallowed by silence. Rumors had always clung to these stones like smoke, too thin to hold, yet too persistent to escape. There were tales of kings who vanished without warning, of feasts interrupted by treachery, of poisoned goblets raised in laughter and followed by death. Some spoke of rulers forced into exile, stripped of name and crown, wandering unknown across foreign lands. Others whispered of secret burials performed under cover of night, when the only witnesses were shadows and the unblinking eyes of ravens perched upon broken towers. The truth was never written, only hinted in fragments of song, half-burned parchments, and the cautious memories of peasants who dared not speak too loudly. The scribe felt this silence pressing into him like a weight that could bend bone and spirit. He looked at the torn banner, still clinging stubbornly to its pole above. The courtyard, its colors, long faded into gray, its threads unraveling like veins emptied of blood. It fluttered weakly against the cold wind, a fragile reminder that authority could be unmade. By betrayal faster than by battle, the banner was no longer a symbol of pride, but of warning that even the highest throne could be emptied in a single night. He stood and walked across the cobblestones, frost crunching beneath his boots, each step echoing as if beneath the ground the voices of the dead kings muttered their grievances. He felt as though the earth itself remembered and resented how quickly men had turned from loyalty to treachery. Each stone carried a secret, each shadow hid a face, half remembered. Each whisper of the wind seemed to tell him, "You will not find the truth," for truth was buried in the graves of those who ruled and those who betrayed. Day raven circled above, and its shadow stretched long and sharp across the courtyard, crossing the scribe's face like a dark omen. He lifted his eyes to it, and for a moment believed that the bird carried the spirits of the vanished kings, that its wings beat with the weight of unspoken histories. He wondered how many had died nameless, how many had been erased deliberately, their legacies scattered like ashes so that only rumors remained. He thought of heirs born into silence, their birthright stolen before their first cry was heard, heirs who would never sit upon the throne because they had been hidden, exiled, or extinguished by blades unseen. The courtyard felt alive with memory, though no man lived there any longer. The air quivered with echoes of conspiracies whispered in candlelit halls when power was divided like bread among thieves. The young scribe heard them faintly, as if the walls themselves exhaled fragments of forgotten dialogue. Do it tonight. No one must know. Burn the records. Silence the witnesses. Seal the door with stone so no trace remains. These voices, not real, yet more vivid than anything alive, forced his heart to pound as though he too stood on the edge of treachery. He pressed his hand against the frozen wall, seeking to steady himself, and in its rough surface felt not just stone, but time itself, scarred and heavy. The wall seemed to hum with centuries of secrets, each layer of mortar binding not only rock to rock, but silence to silence, oath to oath, betrayal to betrayal. And he realized that this was the true legacy of kings, not the crowns, nor the banners, nor the gold, but the silence left in their absence, and the haunting suspicion that none of them had ever truly ruled their own fates. The raven cried again above the tower. The scribe knew he was standing upon a delicate bridge between memory and oblivion. He felt the pull of both, one dragging him deeper into forgotten stories, the other urging him to leave before the silence consumed him. But he could not leave, not yet, for the weight of those vanished kings pressed upon him, demanding to be remembered, even if their names were lost. He knew then that the true history of the realm did not lie in victories sung by minstrels or charters signed with wax, but in the absences, the empty thrones, the vanishing footprints, the nights when torches went dark and rulers ceased to bathe. Cold air carried the faint toll of a bell from a chapel hidden in the woods beyond the ruined walls. Its sound was hollow, distant, yet sharp enough to pierce the heart like a blade. The scribe turned toward it, and in that moment, he felt that the story did not end in the courtyard, that the silence stretched further into the chapels, the crypts, the hidden chambers where prayers and conspiracies intertwined. What had been erased in the courtyard still lingered in the shadows. of stone sanctuaries waiting to be uncovered, and so with the banner shivering above him and the raven circling one last time, he stepped into the passage leading out of the ruins. His lantern swung against the walls, its glow small and fragile, yet strong enough to carve a path through the dark behind him. The courtyard fell silent once more, its stones breathing only frost and memory. Ahead lay the chapels and the hidden sanctuaries where kings sought refuge and conspirators carved there. Oaths the vanished kings had left no words of their own, but their silence demanded to be answered, and it was into that silence that the scribe walked as the night deepened and the story turned toward shadows yet darker still. A pale dawn unfurled across the jagged hills, and the light was sharp like a blade cutting through the cold mist. Frost clung to the toppled siege engines and collapsed battlements that lay scattered as if giants had played at war and then vanished. Without a word, the valley below was drowned in silence, yet every stone and shadow seemed to hold the memory of screams of steel and of prayers. Never answer, day lone messenger trudged over frozen mud, his boots cracked through ice that had settled like glass upon the earth. His cloak was stiff with frost, and his breath rose in clouds that curled and broke in the air. Each step echoed against the emptiness like a drumbeat in a deserted hall. He paused at the remains of a grand structure that had once been the beating heart of a kingdom. Now it stood hollow, its windows gaping like blind eyes, its timbers blackened by fire. The faint scent of soot still lingered, mixing with the iron temps of old blood and the earthy smell of frozen soil. He knelt in the ruins and placed his hand upon the stone. The chill of it seeped through his glove, as though the stone itself remembered the cold hands of the dead. Around him, the ground was littered with broken shields and shattered banners. The colors, once bright, now faded into gray silence among the rubble. His eyes caught the faint gleam of something half buried. A crown bent and dented glinted weakly in the pale sunlight. It was small, worn by years of use, yet unmistakable. A crown without a king, a relic without a master. The messenger touched it, as though it might speak. He imagined the hand that once held it high in victory, the head that once bent beneath its weight. The crown was more than metal. It was promise and burden. It was loyalty, sworn in blood and betrayal, written in whispers. Now it lay abandoned, like the kingdom itself. A silent question pressed against him. What is power when the hand that wields it has turned to dust above him? Ravens wheeled in slow circles, their cries harsh and hollow. They settled upon the stones, watching as though they too remembered the fall of kings. Their wings beat the air, stirring frost into fleeting clouds. Their shadows stretched across the stones like dark stains that could never be washed away. They were witnesses, ancient and unflinching, to the rise and ruin of Thronza. Messenger's heart was heavy. He could almost hear the voices of those who had stood in these halls. Soldiers swearing oaths under torchlight courtiers, whispering alliances in shadowed corners, betrayals hidden beneath smiles and banquets. The weight of those choices still lingered here in the frost, in the stone, in the silence. He rose and walked beyond the ruins. A river wound its way through the valley, its waters catching the pale dawn light. The surface shimmered like broken glass, but beneath it ran dark currents, swift and unseen. The messenger stood on its bank and watched the flow, as though it carried secrets older than the crown, older than the war. The river did not remember names, yet it carried their echoes. It whispered of rulers who had vanished from memory, yet whose shadows still shaped the world. Day gust of wind swept down the valley, stirring ash from the ruins into the air. The messenger closed his eyes and let the chill bite into his skin. He thought of kings who had fallen not in glory, but in silence, of queens who had watched power slip from their grasp like sand, of children who had been born to rule yet vanished before they could speak their first oath. He thought of all the crowns buried by time, each one once gleaming in the light, each one now rusted, bent, forgotten. He turned back to the crown lying in the frost. His hand hovered above it. He could carry it to another hall, to another throne, or leave it to the earth to be swallowed by silence. The choice was heavy, for crowns were never merely gold. They were hunger, they were fire, they were both hope and curse. Left it lying there in the frost and stepped away. His breath hung in the cold air, and he walked on into the valley toward the river that carried the memory of all who had risen and fallen. The sun climbed higher, and its light spilled across the ruins, yet it did not warm them. It only revealed the scars left by battles that no one remembered. The messenger knew this silence would not last. Another king would come, another war would rise, another crown would gleam in the light and fall into the dirt, for this was the rhythm of the aged. Thrones were not built to endure. They were built to be claimed, to be broken, to be badass. He followed the river. The sound of water filled the air, a soft, endless song, whispering of what was to come. It promised that this story of crowns and ruins was not yet over. It promised that in the silence of the valley, the seeds of another struggle were already stirring. The messenger walked on his shadow. Long in the pale light, the crown lay behind him, half buried in frost, waiting for the hand that would lift it again, waiting for the blood that would be spilled in its name. And the valley held its breath, knowing that silence never lasts forever. The wind tore across the ruined battlement, carrying with it a mournful cry that seemed older than stone itself, scattering brittle leaves and fragments of parchment over frost-hardened ground where soldiers once marched and banners once flew. A knight cloaked against the bitter air crouched low, his gloved hand brushing the ragged edge of a toppled banner once proud and defiant. Now little more than cloth, beaten thin by storms. He traced the torn threads as if they were veins of memory, and in their fraying he imagined the vanished kings whose commands had sealed fates and drawn lines of blood upon the earth. Keep around him groaned with age, walls crumbling under centuries of silence, where laughter and shouts had once echoed. He could almost hear them faintly, the triumphant cheers of men returning from war, the hollow command of a sovereign whose words weighed heavier than any sword. The sound was gone, but the stone remembered it, and in that memory the knight felt the weight of 1,000 choices made by hands long reduced to dust smoke, drifted on the wind, not the thick choking smoke of war, but the faint lingering haze of distant villages where fires burned low to warm the living. It mixed with the crisp scent of pine needles and cold clay, and the knight closed his eyes, letting the smells carry him into a past he had never seen yet could feel in his very marrow. He opened them again to the call of a raven, sharp and solitary, slicing the silence like a judgment. It circled above the keep, its black wings stark against the pale dawn, as if marking the passage of rulers erased from the earth their legacies. Scattered like ash, his gaze fell to a rusted helmet, half buried in frost, the visor dented. From a forgotten blow, he lifted it with both hands, its weight heavier than it should have been. not from metal alone, but from the invisible hands that still clung to it. Betrayers and loyalists, schemers and martyrs, the visor caught the dawn's weak light, and for an instant he saw his own reflection staring back, hollow-eyed and weary, like the ghosts who lingered in every corner of this place. The knight walked slowly through the ruin, his boots grinding against broken stone, each step sending echoes into empty corridors. He knelt by a shattered shield, its wood splintered and blackened with fire. He touched the burn marks and smelled again the sharp sting of smoke that once filled lungs and choked cries of both victory and despair. He lifted a charred timber, its brittle surface crumbling between his fingers, and in that small motion he felt the full weight of vanished dominion, kings and lords who believed their walls unshakable, their crowns eternal. Yet all crowns fall and all banners fade, and the silence of this place carried the proof of that truth. The knight straightened his back, his cloak tugged by the restless wind. He looked out toward the distant river, glimmering like a blade beneath the sky. The water ran endlessly, carrying away ashes, bones, and memories alike, as though it were the last true chronicler of kingdoms lost in his heart. He felt a question burn, not spoken, but heavy. What is the inheritance of a throne when only frost and stone remain? Is it power that lingers, or only suffering passed from hand to hand like a curse? He thought of peasants bending beneath winter's cruelty, their hunger gnawing louder than any king's decree. He thought of men who bled on soil that never remembered their names, and he thought of the rulers themselves, seated on high chairs of oak and iron, their words shaping lives, yet unable to hold back the march of death. He stepped across the threshold of the keep, where the gate once barred entry, now only shards of wood hung on twisted iron. The ground here was softer, rich with moss and creeping roots, reclaiming what man had tried to own. Time had become the true conqueror, its patience greater than any army, its victory undeniable. The knight's eyes turned to the horizon, where faint smoke rose again, not from hearths this time, but from unseen fires. Perhaps a village caught in rebellion, or perhaps another lord burning his rival's fields. The world beyond these stones still moved, still warred, still crowned and buried men in the endless cycle of power and ruin. And in that rising smoke, he saw not only what was, but what would come. Endless generations bound to repeat the same trials, as though shackled to the mistakes of those who came before they. Raven cried once more, circling lower, until it landed on a jagged stone near the knight. Its beak tapped against the rock, sharp and deliberate, and in the hollow sound the knight heard the voice of memory whispering that kings are forgotten not because their deeds were small, but because time swallows all. Yet in the whispers, in the stories, in the fragments of song and shadow, their presence lingers. Their rule may be dust, but their choices live on in the bones of the living, in the scars of the land. The knight bowed his head, as though before an unseen audience. He whispered a prayer, not to a king, not to a saint, but to the truth itself, that the burdens of power never vanish, they only shift. He rose again, shoulders squared against the wind, his eyes fixed upon the glimmering river and the smoke beyond, for he knew that the path forward was bound to the shadows of the past. And as he turned from the ruins, the morning sun broke weakly over the horizon, gilding the frost with pale fire. The light touched the rusted helm, the shattered banner, the blackened shield, each one transformed for a moment into relics of sacred memory. Before him stretched the road into the chronicles of forgotten kings, a road that promised not glory but revelation of secrets hidden in stone, frost, and shadow. The wind carried him onward toward the next chapter of history, and with it the haunting question of how power once held and now lost would shape the lives yet to come. Fog pressed low over the village square, wrapping timber and stone in a suffocating veil of damp gray. The air carried the sour temp smoke mixed with the earthy scent of wet soil, as though the ground itself remembered fire and ruin. The marketplace that once rang with voices now stood abandoned. Carts lay, shattered banners hung in tatters, and silence was broken only by the slow drip of water from roofs. Heavy with frost, through this silence moved a lone scholar, his cloak weighed down with moisture, his breath forming pale clouds in the frigid air. He bent to touch the ground where mud held the imprint of hooves and wagon wheels, marks of a life that had ended abruptly. His hand brushed against a splintered fence, then lingered on the charred edges of a banner, its colors swallowed by flame, its crest nearly erased. What remained spoke of loyalty once demanded, of oaths once spoken, yet all undone by betrayal and time. The scholar entered the crumbling tower at the edge of the square. Stone walls, slick with moss, shadows clinging like old wounds. A chest lay hidden in the rubble, its lock rusted but unbroken, a survivor of storms and years of silence. With effort, he pried it open. The hinges groaned like the last breath of an old soldier. Inside lay the relics of vanished authority, crowns dulled by dust, letters folded with care, maps ink fading at the edges, each one a fragment of power once grasped and then lost. He lifted a crown, its rim bent as if struck in fury, and felt a strange weight settle into his hand. It was not gold that pressed upon him, but memory, the residue of command, the echo of voices that once bent the knee and raised the sword in service. The dent spoke of a strike, a rebellion, a moment where glory cracked and fear crept in. This was no ornament, it was a scar, captured in metal. The letters told of desperate negotiations, of alliances formed in shadows, of betrayals whispered in candlelit halls. Some bore the seal of kings who vanished without grave or monument, their names reduced to rumor, carried by frightened lips. Others revealed promises never kept, armies never marched, dreams abandoned in the tide of ambition. The maps traced borders that shifted like restless tides, lands torn and sewn together again by blood and steel, each change erasing one king and crowning another. Outside the tower, the fog shifted like a curtain pulled back by unseen hands, revealing a river glimmering faintly in the weak winter light, its surface mirrored the pale sky, and the scholar saw in it the reflection of crowns and banners dissolving into ripples. The river whispered of time, swallowing all, yet carrying fragments forward, shaping lands that no longer remembered the hands that once ruled them. Scholar felt the weight of the crown in his hands, not as treasure, but as confession. Every dent, every tarnish, every faded seal was proof of the fragility of authority. Kings believed themselves eternal, yet they vanished like smoke, their power drowned in silence, leaving only symbols for strangers to unearth centuries. Later, he placed the crown back into the chest with reverence, as if laying a body into the earth. The air grew colder, shadows lengthened, and the tower groaned with the wind. In that moment he understood that the vanished kings had not disappeared entirely. They lingered in silence, in the shifting of rivers, in the forgotten ink, on parchment, in the heavy beat of history that refused to die as he turned to leave. The fog closed in again, swallowing the square, the tower, the chest, and all its secrets. Only the faint cry of a raven cut through the stillness, a sound that echoed like a warning, for if the past could vanish so easily, then what of the present, what of the crowns? Now resting on eager brows, would they to be swallowed by silence? Would their power dissolve into dust, carried away by rivers and fog? The scholar walked back toward the river, each step sinking into the wet earth behind him. The tower faded into shadow ahead. The water glimmered like a mirror, waiting to reveal another story. The vanished kings were not gone. Their shadows stretched across the land, still guiding it in silence. And beyond the river, another truth waited to be uncovered, another chapter of power and betrayal waiting to rise from the mist. A cold wind whispered through the shattered bones of a chapel, once alive with song, its timbers blackened by fire, its walls cracked and scarred like the flesh of a soldier who had survived too many battles. The scent of smoke clung still to the stone, though the fire had long since died, mingling with the damp weight of moss and the bitter perfume of wet stone. The silence was heavy, as if it bore the weight of centuries. Young acolyte stepped softly across the ruined nave, his breath curling in the frost as he traced his fingers over the symbols carved into the walls, their edges softened by time and yet still pulsing with meaning. Each was a mark of kings, long gone sovereigns who had ruled with iron and prayer, only to vanish without ceremony or song, their names scattered like ash across forgotten chronicles, their absence reshaping kingdoms more powerfully than their presence ever could. The echoes of prayers still lingered within these hollow stones, voices raised once in hope, for victory in pleas, for rain in desperate cries, for children to live through winter. Now nothing more than faint murmurs, swallowed by silence. Yet even in silence they carried weight, the invisible weight of lives lived and lost, the haunting rhythm of a world that remembered even when it wished to forget. Outside, in the churchyard, frost clung to crooked gravestones like a shroud of glass, and the cry of a raven cut the stillness like a blade, its wings beating against the air as if mocking the silence of the dead. The bird circled above the ruined chapel, an uninvited sentinel marking the passage of time, reminding those who walked beneath its shadow that secrets were never truly buried. They only shifted like smoke, curling into the rafters of history. The acolyte's hand fell upon the broken lectern, its surface scarred with grooves carved by the hands of countless scribes who had once chronicled the deeds of kings. Alliances forged in blood, oaths whispered in the dark betrayals that shattered crowns. Each groove was a scar of memory pressed into the wood, as though the very act of writing had left a wound. And now the lectern stood like a relic of silence, holding stories that the world no longer dared to speak aloud. At his feet lay tattered vestments, their embroidery faded, but still hinting at the glory of processions where incense once clouded the air. Beside them, fragments of manuscripts curled like dead leaves, scorched by fire, yet still clinging to words that named victories and sins. Shattered chalices gleamed faintly beneath a film of dust. Each artifact was a fragment of power, each a whisper of faith, each a symbol of sudden, staggered disappearance. Together they wove a tapestry of absence, and absence itself was more powerful than presence. The boy bent down, lifting a fragment of parchment, its edges brittle, its letters half consumed by flame, and yet what remained carried weight, a prayer written in haste, a name hastily scratched, as if in warning. The ink blurred by tears or rain, the acolyte stared at it, wondering what it meant and why the writer had been silenced so swiftly. Behind every burned word lay a vanished voice. Behind every vanished voice, a missing Kinghe raised his gaze to the shattered windows where sunlight slipped through in pale beams, striking the dust that swirled in the air. The light illuminated ruin and continuity alike. Ruin in the fractured walls, continuity in the fact that he stood here, breathing, still searching, still trying to remember what had been erased. The line between past and present seemed as fragile as the frost outside, a delicate line where forgotten kings lingered in shadow, not gone but watching. And in that moment he understood survival was not just the act of breathing, it was the act of remembering. To forget was to betray the bones beneath the earth. To forget. They did not choose. The acolyte's breath trembled as he whispered a prayer, not for victory, not for gold, but for memory to hold. Fast beyond the chapel on the horizon, the pale sun rose, sluggish and weak, its warmth unable to pierce the frost yet. Its light stretched across the ruined land, touching graves, stones, rivers, and castles alike, a reminder that though kingdoms fell and crowns turned to dust, the world moved onward. The invisible pulse of history never ceased. Its beat carried not by kings alone, but by those who remembered them, or who dared to dig through ruin to find the faint whisper of their names. The raven cried again, circling higher as if to lead the gaze beyond the ruin, toward distant horizons, toward the unseen forces that shaped survival and loyalty, forces more powerful than swords, more enduring than crowns. The acolyte lowered his head and pressed his palm to the stone. The stone was cold but steady, like the memory of something lost yet unbroken. And so the story moved forward, from kings remembered in absence to the shadows of those unseen forces that would decide who lived, who starved, who endured. The fragile heartbeat of a kingdom, carried not in gold or banners, but in silence, in faith, and in the invisible chains that bound all to the weight of history. Would you like me to continue the next chapter? Transition directly now, so the flow is seamless across chapters? Or do you want each chapter as a separate request so you can control pacing, piece by piece? Moonlight spread across the frost-covered valley, where silence pressed heavy upon the ruins of a fortress that once thundered with life. Its towers leaned like weary soldiers who had long abandoned their post, yet still stood as reminders of what once was. The stones breathed with the memory of voices that had long since faded. A solitary scout moved among them, his steps hushed against the frozen earth, the smell of damp soil and rusted iron clinging to the night air. He carried no torch, for the moon itself lit his path and unveiled the scars of history etched into every broken wall. He traced the paths that kings had once walked, corridors where monarchs had whispered promises and spoken commands that shaped the fates of nations. Yet now only the crunch of frost underfoot answered him. Splintered doors gaped open like wounds, and broken standards lay tangled upon the ground, stripped of meaning, stripped of pride. Each fragment told of rebellion and betrayal, of fragile authority shattered by ambition or sudden death. The fortress was no longer a home of power, but a graveyard of its illusions. At the base of a crumbled stair, the scout's gaze caught a glimmer in the frost there. Half buried lay a dented crown. Its gold had dulled with time, but it seemed to pulse with the weight of forgotten rulers. The crown was more than a relic. It was a silent witness. It had once pressed against the brows of kings who swore to protect their people, who sought glory, who feared the treachery that often lurked closest to their side. Now it rested cold and unwanted, a circle of metal, heavy with stories that no lips could tell above. A raven wheeled in the night sky, its cry cutting through the stillness. Its shadow passed across the battlements. A black wing stretched over broken stone. The bird circled as if guarding memory itself, a sentinel of all that had been erased from mortal tongues. The scout followed its flight with uneasy eyes. In its shape he saw omen and truth, that kingdoms may crumble, but memory has ways of clinging to ruins long after flesh and blood have vanished. Step into the courtyard, stirred phantoms. He could almost hear the echoes of feasts where laughter rose high and torches burned late into the night. He could almost see councils gathered around oaken tables where maps were spread and secrets guarded. He could almost smell the smoke of battles whose cries shook these very walls. Yet all who lived those moments had been swallowed by silence, leaving only stones and shadows behind. The scout shivered, though not from the cold, for he walked among ghosts beyond the walls. A river shimmered in the moonlight, flowing silver across the valley. Its current whispered, as though it carried with it the ambitions of rulers long gone. They had believed their will would last forever, yet the river had outlived them all, sweeping away their victories and their defeats alike. The scout stood at the edge of the ruin, watching that water move endlessly forward, and he felt the weight of truth. Power does not stay. Crowns fall, thrones empty, yet the world continues. In indifferent silence he knelt once more before the dented crown, brushing frost from its edges. He wondered who had last worn it, whether that king had died in battle or in betrayal, whether his last sight had been the glint of a dagger or the grief of his people. He imagined the moment it fell from a lifeless brow into mud and snow, its fall unnoticed by the world beyond these walls. To touch it was to touch absence itself, a circle not of gold, but of sorrow. The scout rose and gazed across the valley, where the horizon glowed faintly with the coming dawn. The night seemed to hold its breath, caught between memory and forgetting. These ruins did not only tell of kings, they told of people whose lives had bent beneath decisions made within these halls. Farmers taxed to fill treasuries, soldiers bled to defend ambitions, servants silenced in the machinery of courtly power. Their voices, too, had been carried into the dark by the river's endless song. As he turned to leave the fortress, the raven shrieked once more and vanished into the night. The scout paused, unsettled. He felt that to leave was to abandon something sacred, yet to stay was to risk being consumed by the weight of memory itself. He pressed forward with steady steps, carrying the vision of the crown in his mind. Though dulled and broken, it still glowed within him as a reminder that history is not measured only by victory, but by silence, by absence, by the shadows left in ruined Halsand. As he moved beyond the shattered gates into the valley, the dawn light began to spill across the land. It touched the broken stones with pale fire, unveiling them not as corpses, but as scars, scars that whispered of destiny, of power, of betrayal. of the frailty of rulers who believed themselves eternal. The scout's breath rose in the morning air as he asked a silent question to himself and to the valley. Alike, how many more crowns would fall? How many more thrones would be left to crumble in frost and silence? The river answered only with its endless flow. It beckoned the scout onward, toward the lands beyond, toward the stories yet to be revealed. For in every ruin lies a beginning, and in every silence waits the echo of voices that once commanded the world. The valley fell behind him, but the memory of the dented crown lingered like a weight upon his heart, guiding him deeper into the shadowed tapestry of forgotten kings and vanished legacies. And with each step, the path seemed to darken toward the truths that waited just beyond the horizon.